Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the unsettling case of Clara Caldwell, the girl whose mind held a secret too vast for our world that you might have never heard before, a mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled, and if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder. Don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The tall pines of the Missouri Ozarks have stood as silent witnesses to countless generations, their needles whispering stories of hardship, resilience, and secrets buried deeper than any root. They have watched families rise from the stubborn soil and return to it, and the slow, creeping tendrils of the modern world fail, time and again, to fully penetrate their ancient shaded domain. But few tales carried on the wind are as perplexing, as profoundly unsettling, as the one that unfolded in the dead of winter, 1915. It is a story that begins not with a scream, but with a silence so complete, so unnatural. It became an oppressive weight that finally drew the world of men into its chilling embrace. On the bitter, cold morning of December 18th, Sheriff Thomas Lawson's breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a fleeting ghost against the gray, unforgiving sky. A veteran of Shannon County's harsh winters, a man whose face was a roadmap of past droughts and blizzards, Lawson was no stranger to the trials of the land. Yet, as he and his neighbor, Hiram Jenkins, made their difficult journey through nearly 2 feet of fresh snow, a primal unease settled deep in his gut. Jenkins, a wiry farmer whose disposition was as sturdy as the oaks on his property, had been the one to finally raise the alarm. His home was the closest to the Caldwells, a good mile away, but from the high ground near his barn, he could just make out the thin stone finger of their chimney against the skyline. For several days, the chimney had remained stark and lifeless. "It ain't right, Tom," Jenkins had insisted, his voice tight with a farmer's practical fear of the cold. "Not in a frost like this. Not with a child in the house." Their destination was the isolated Caldwell family home, a modest cabin perched on a ridge overlooking the frozen, silver ribbon of the Jack's Fork River. For nearly 2 weeks, since the last heavy snow had sealed the winding dirt roads, no one in the nearby town of eminence had seen any sign of life from the reclusive family. This wasn't entirely unusual. Winter in the Ozarks was a time of hunkering down, of families becoming islands in a sea of white. But the persistent absence of smoke was a fundamental violation of the laws of survival in these unforgiving hills. The path to the cabin was a virgin canvas of white, a perfect, undisturbed blanket that spoke volumes. No tracks marred its surface, not from a wagon, not from a horse, not even from a single human footstep. The profound stillness was the first piece of evidence, a silent testimony to absolute isolation. No one had come, no one had left. As they drew closer, the silence itself seemed to deepen, to become a physical presence. The world seemed muted, caught in a crystallized moment of suspense. The cabin sat there, as Jenkins would later describe in a sworn statement, like it was holding its breath, waiting for a judgment. Sheriff Lawson, his hand gloved against the cold, knocked, his knuckles rapping sharply against the rough-hewn timber door. The sound was flat, swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. He knocked again, louder this time, his voice joining the effort. "Mr. Caldwell, Mary, anyone home?" Only the mournful sighing of the wind through the ice-laden pines answered. Finding the door unlocked a deeply unusual act in such an isolated place, Lawson exchanged a grim look with Jenkins before pushing it open. His other hand, almost unconsciously, rested on the cold, familiar metal of his service revolver. The cold that met them from inside was a different kind of cold. It wasn't the clean chill of the winter air. It was a dead, stagnant cold, thick with the scent of old ash and abandonment. The main room was immaculate, unnaturally so, for a home with a young child that relied on a wood stove for heat. It was sterile. A thin layer of dust coated the surfaces with an even, undisturbed perfection. The wood stove held only old, grey ash, not even a single lingering ember. A half-empty cup of tea sat on the table, its contents frozen into a solid, amber disk, a tiny, mundane tragedy trapped in ice. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no scattered belongings that would suggest a violent intrusion or a hasty departure. Robert and Mary's heavy winter coats still hung on pegs by the door. On the rough-hewn mantel, small, precious items remained untouched. Mary's mother's silver brooch and Robert's heavy pocket watch. It was a scene not of chaos, but of a sudden, inexplicable cessation, as if the occupants had simply evaporated mid-moment. But it was in the small back bedroom that the fabric of reality began to unravel. There, at a small wooden desk by the window, sat 12-year-old Clara Caldwell. She was alive, but not truly present. Her gaze fixed on something far beyond the frosted windowpane, beyond the snow-covered trees, perhaps beyond the world itself. The sheriff described her as being in a trance-like state, utterly unresponsive to their calls. And then Lawson felt it a strange, inexplicable, and deeply unsettling warmth emanating from this room alone. A gentle heat that pushed back against the tomb-like cold of the rest of the cabin, despite no fire burning anywhere. His eyes, adjusting to the dim light, began to take in the details of the room, and a shiver, entirely unrelated to the cold, traced its way down his spine. The rough wooden walls of Clara's small room were covered, from floor to ceiling, in a sprawling, chaotic tapestry of symbols. There were hundreds of them, some pinned on scraps of paper, others drawn directly onto the wood in a dark, thick pencil. There were drawings of strange, geometric shapes, complex diagrams of unknown constellations, and what he could only describe as mathematical equations. Her small desk was a landscape of notebooks, all filled with dense, precise script and formulas that would have been foreign to the most educated men in Missouri, let alone a 12-year-old girl. Most disturbing of all were her hands. They were stained with ink up to the wrists, the dark pigment ground into her skin and under her fingernails. The hands of someone who had been writing, relentlessly and without pause, for days, gently, cautiously, as if approaching a wild creature. The sheriff placed a hand on her shoulder. The girl turned slowly, her movements stiff, her eyes focusing with an almost painful difficulty. They were ancient eyes in a young face, holding a depth of knowledge and a profound weariness that did not belong there. She looked at the two men, not with fear or surprise, but with a distant clarity. And then she spoke. Her voice was a flat, emotionless whisper that cut through the unnatural warmth of the room. "They're gone," she said. "They had to go. The numbers needed room." To truly comprehend the impossible scene that confronted Sheriff Lawson, one must first understand the land itself and the quiet family that had sought refuge within its isolating embrace. The Ozark Mountains of 1915 were a world apart. A rugged and ancient tapestry of rolling hills, deep, shadowed hollows, and dense hardwood forests where mist clung to the valleys. It was a place of profound beauty and equally profound isolation, a land where communities were small, fiercely self-reliant, and wary of outsiders. News from the wider world arrived like a slow-moving river, making the Great War raging across the ocean feel like a distant, abstract nightmare. The people here lived by the rhythm of the seasons, their lives governed by the harvest, the hunt, and the harsh realities of winter. It was a landscape that nurtured a stoic independence, but also buried secrets with quiet efficiency. A perfect sanctuary for those wishing to disappear into this world. In the spring of 1913 came the Caldwell family. County records show that Robert Caldwell, a former railroad engineer from the bustling city of St. Louis, had inherited the modest property from a distant relative. He, his wife Mary, and their only child, Clara, were seeking a quieter existence by local standards. They were considered good neighbors, if private ones. Robert occasionally took on odd jobs in the town of eminence, his hands, accustomed to the mechanics of a locomotive, proving useful in barn raising. He was a capable man, but a quiet one. Mary sold what many considered the best blackberry preserves in the county at the general store, her quilts known for their meticulous stitching. She, too, was a reserved presence, her interactions polite but brief. They were a portrait of simple normalcy, a family seeking nothing more than to be left to the peace of their wooded ridge. Yet, this very normalcy is what makes the events of December 1915 so profoundly terrifying. In the 2 years they lived on that ridge, there were no reports of strange visitors, no unusual purchases, no documented peculiar behavior that might have warned of a coming storm. Their background was as plain as the land they now inhabited. Robert had an 8th grade education. Mary had a little more schooling. They were ordinary people, products of their time, living an ordinary life. This placid surface, so carefully maintained, makes the unfathomable darkness that erupted from within their home all the more shocking. Their daughter, Clara, was the quiet center of their small world. She was described by her schoolteacher, Miss Eleanor Whitman, as a shy but intelligent child. She possessed a natural, noteworthy aptitude for arithmetic, a neatness with numbers that stood out but was not considered alarming. She was simply a bright girl, often seen with her nose in a book, her mind a fertile ground for the seeds of knowledge planted in the humble. One-room schoolhouse, nothing in her history, however, could have possibly prepared anyone for the terrible and alien harvest that was to come. She attended school when the 7-mile journey was possible, a trek that became increasingly rare as the first snows of late 1915 began to fall, isolating the family further, wrapping them in a cocoon of silence and white. It was within this pristine, silent cocoon that the metamorphosis began. The final, confirmed sighting of Robert and Mary Caldwell was on December 4th. The ledger at Wilson's General Store, a thick, leather-bound book whose pages now feel as brittle as autumn leaves, holds the last mundane record of their existence. The entry lists Robert's purchases: flour, coffee, sugar, kerosene, the staples of winter survival. And one final item, a tablet of paper. The shop owner, Elias Wilson, later recounted to Sheriff Lawson that Robert had seemed ordinary that day, perhaps a bit preoccupied with the coming snow. But he did mention one thing, a simple, proud observation that would, in retrospect, become a chilling portent. Robert had remarked that Clara had been taking to her studies with unusual vigor and had requested more paper for her schoolwork. Wilson remembered that Robert hadn't just bought one tablet, but all 3 that the store had in stock. It was the first tremor, the first tangible sign that the quiet ground of his daughter's mind was beginning to experience a seismic shift. It was the last time anyone in town would ever see Robert Caldwell alive. From that day forward, a curtain of snow and silence fell around the Caldwell cabin, a silence that would last for 14 days before the world came knocking. In the days that followed Clara's discovery, the mystery of her parents' whereabouts deepened into an impenetrable void. Sheriff Lawson, driven by a grim sense of duty, organized searches that radiated outwards from the silent cabin in ever-widening circles. Teams of men from Eminence and the surrounding communities, their faces grim under the winter sky, combed the dense, snow-laden forests. They dragged sections of the Jack's Fork River, the iron hooks scraping uselessly against the thick ice. They explored the dark mouths of abandoned mines and the cold, damp caves that dotted the Ozark landscape. They found nothing. Not a footprint preserved in a sheltered hollow. Not a scrap of torn clothing caught on a wood-thorn branch. And not a single sign to suggest the fate of Robert and Mary Caldwell. The wilderness had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only an unnerving silence and their strangely transformed child. Meanwhile, Clara remained under observation at the home of Dr. William Hayes in Eminence, removed from the unnaturally warmed room of her family's cabin. She was now an anomaly in the heart of small-town domesticity. Dr. Hayes's wife, Judith, a pragmatic and kind-hearted woman, kept a daily journal of the girl's behavior. Its pages later submitted as evidence in the official investigation. These entries, written in a neat, worried hand, paint a portrait of a child utterly disconnected from human normalcy. Judith Hayes noted that Clara slept very little, sometimes for only an hour or two a night, yet showed no signs of fatigue. She ate mechanically, only when food was placed directly before her, chewing and swallowing without any apparent taste or enjoyment, and almost every waking moment. She was consumed by a single, relentless drive to write. Mrs. Hayes recorded with growing alarm that Clara would use any available surface if not provided with sufficient materials, pages torn from precious books, the margins of newspapers, even the frost on a window pane, her small finger tracing intricate, fleeting patterns. An entry dated December 21st, 1915, captures the household's mixture of awe and profound unease. Clara filled 7 full tablets today with what William says appears to be advanced mathematics and scientific formulas. When I asked where she learned such things, she looked at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "I didn't learn them," she said, her voice clear but distant. "They're just there now." The child shows no distress over her parents, which troubles me greatly. It is not the brave face of a child in shock. It is a complete and total absence of concern. It is as if she has forgotten them entirely, or worse, sees their absence as inconsequential. This chilling detachment was the most disturbing element. Clara was not a grieving daughter. She was a vessel. And the disappearance of her parents was merely a prerequisite, a necessary clearing of space for the vast, intrusive knowledge that now defined her existence. Word of the strange case spread with the speed of winter gossip, first through Shannon County, then carried by telegraph and newspaper to the wider world beyond the Ozarks. On December 23rd, the quiet town of Eminence saw the arrival of a man who represented the first intrusion of formal academic inquiry into the burgeoning mystery. Professor James Morgan from the University of Missouri, a respected mathematician with a keen interest in child prodigies, had traveled from Columbia after hearing a garbled version of the story from a colleague. He arrived cloaked in professional skepticism, fully expecting to find a simple case for traumatized child and overwrought local reports. His skepticism, however, did not survive his first encounter with Clara. in a letter to his department chair, a document later published in the university's academic journal. Morgan's intellectual composure gives way to sheer astonishment. "What I witnessed today defies rational explanation," he wrote, his penmanship reportedly less steady than usual. The child, a 12-year-old girl with no access to advanced education or even a local library of any substance, is producing work in the fields of non-Euclidean geometry, differential equations, and what appears to be a form of theoretical physics that would challenge our most accomplished graduate students. I presented her with a problem that has occupied my own research for the better part of a year. She solved it in under 10 minutes, not by showing her work, but by simply writing the correct final answer as if it were a self-evident truth. Morgan spent 3 days in Eminence, poring over Clara's notebooks with a mixture of academic ecstasy and creeping dread. With the permission of Sheriff Lawson, who had been appointed her temporary guardian, he brought several pages of her work back to the university for a more thorough analysis. Experts in various scientific fields there confirmed his initial assessment. The work was not only legitimate, but contained several novel and, frankly, brilliant approaches to existing problems in physics and mathematics. Yet, Clara herself seemed to have no understanding of how she came to possess this knowledge when questioned directly by the professor. She responded with the same unnerving simplicity she had offered Mrs. Hayes. "I went to sleep, and when I woke up, the numbers were there. They're so loud now," she added, a flicker of something, perhaps pain, perhaps irritation, crossing her face for the first time. They needed more room. By early January of 1916, Clara's case had become a focal point for the scientific and medical communities across the Midwest. The search for her parents had been officially scaled back, with most locals settling on one of two grim theories. Either the couple had met with a tragic accident in the unforgiving wilderness, or they had simply abandoned their child for reasons unknown. Neither theory, however, could begin to explain the profound and inexplicable transformation in Clara herself. On January 12th, at the joint recommendation of a baffled Dr. Hayes and an insistent Professor Morgan, the decision was made. Clara was to be transferred to Missouri State Hospital No. 4 in Farmington for a more comprehensive and systematic evaluation. The admission records, preserved in the state archives, list her condition with cold, clinical uncertainty, acute mental alteration of unknown origin with savant-like manifestations. As she was prepared for the journey, leaving the small town of Eminence behind, it became clear that the mystery was no longer a local tragedy. Clara Caldwell had become a scientific specimen, a human puzzle to be dissected, and the next chapter of her life would unfold within the sterile walls of an institution, raising disturbing new questions about the nature of human consciousness, the origins of knowledge, and what might happen when something from outside our understanding takes up residence in a human mind. The journey from Eminence to Farmington in the heart of a Missouri winter took nearly 2 days by wagon and train, according to Dr. Hayes's notes. Clara remained docile throughout, continuing her frantic writing whenever possible. During the train portion of the trip, she filled 14 pages with dense equations. When Hayes, in a moment of curiosity, asked what she was calculating, she replied without looking up from her work, "The motion of the train, the vibrations have patterns. I need to record them." Missouri State Hospital No. 4, established in 1903, was considered one of the more progressive mental health facilities of its time. Under the direction of Dr. Franklin Pierce, the hospital took a scientific approach to mental illness, attempting to classify and understand conditions rather than simply confine patients in perpetuity. Upon her arrival, Clara was placed in the children's ward under the direct supervision of Dr. Eleanor Reed, one of the few female psychiatrists practicing in Missouri at that time. Dr. Reed was a meticulous and compassionate professional, and her detailed case notes provide the most comprehensive documentation of Clara's condition during the early months of 1916. Patient exhibits extraordinary cognitive abilities in specific domains: mathematics, physics, astronomy, with no prior training or exposure to advanced concepts in these fields, she wrote in her initial assessment. Physically, she appears normal for her age and development. Basic neurological examinations reveal no abnormalities. She is oriented to person and place, but seems to have an altered perception of time, often unable to distinguish between the recent and distant past. It was Dr. Reed who conducted the series of interviews that would provide the first terrifying glimpse into the heart of the phenomenon. Transcripts of these sessions were preserved in the hospital archives until May, according to later reports. They were classified and removed by government officials in 1954. Fortunately, copies of some sessions remained among Professor Morgan's personal papers. In one particularly revealing session from February 1916, Dr. Reed attempted to gently probe the origin of Clara's knowledge. "Clara," Dr. Reed began, her voice calm and even, "can you tell me how you know these things you write about?" Clara looked up from the notebook on her lap, her expression patient, as if explaining something obvious to a slow learner. "I told you, they're just there now. But these are complex ideas that most adults don't understand." Doctor Reed pressed gently. "You didn't know these things before December, correct?" A shadow passed over Clara's face. "Before the cold night," she confirmed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Before they went away." "Your parents?" Doctor Reed clarified. Clara nodded slowly. "They had to make room. It was getting crowded. Here, Doctor." Reed paused, choosing her next words carefully. "What was getting crowded, Clara?" Clara was silent for a long time, her gaze turned inward. "My head," she finally said. "But it's not just my head anymore. It goes all the way down now. Sometimes I can feel it in my fingers and toes. The knowing." The session took a chilling turn as Dr. Reed guided the conversation back to the night her parents disappeared. "Did something happen on that cold night, Clara?" Clara's eyes widened, a raw, remembered terror suddenly surfacing. "The sky opened," she whispered, leaning forward. "Not for everyone, just for me. It poured in like water, except it wasn't wet. It was heavy, heavy like honey, but sharper. They tried to make it stop. They couldn't." "Who tried to make it stop, Doctor?" Reed asked, her own pulse quickening. Clara became agitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "They did," she said, her voice rising. "They put their hands on my head. They prayed, they cried, but it kept coming, and there wasn't enough room for all of us." Doctor Reed's notes following this session reveal a mind grappling with a possibility that lay far outside the bounds of established psychiatry. Patient appears to be describing some form of dissociative episode or psychotic break, likely triggered by the trauma of her parents' disappearance. Yet, her cognitive functions in other areas remain not only intact but supernaturally enhanced. Most disturbing is a continued implication that her parents' disappearance was somehow a direct consequence of a sudden acquisition of knowledge. While I hesitate to give credence to such a suggestion from a purely scientific standpoint, the timing of the events cannot be ignored. The interview had opened a terrifying new door. The mystery was no longer just about where Robert and Mary Caldwell had gone. The new, far more frightening question was what, exactly, had arrived in their place. The spring of 1916 marked a chilling turning point in Clara Caldwell's case. A period where the abstract horror of a mental transformation began to manifest as a concrete, physical decay. The theoretical had become physiological. Doctor reads notes from late April, penned with a troubled hand. Document the first undeniable signs of this deterioration. Patient complains of headaches, she wrote, that increase in severity in direct correlation with her attempts to write or calculate. Episodes of epistaxis nosebleeds have begun, particularly following periods of intense cognitive activity. By May, Clara's once prolific mathematical output had decreased, though what she did produce was described by visiting experts as becoming ever more abstract. Professor Morgan wrote that her work had moved beyond the frameworks of established mathematics into something he could only describe as a new terrifying language of numbers and space. Her physical condition, meanwhile, continued its alarming decline. Hospital records chart a rapid weight loss despite a monitored diet. Her sleep became erratic, with nurses reporting that she would sometimes remain awake for 50 or 60 hours straight, her hand moving continuously across the page, only to collapse into a deep, death-like sleep for a similar period. During these phases of deep unconsciousness, staff noted her body temperature would drop to dangerously low levels, sometimes to 94 degrees Fahrenheit, as if her metabolism was being consumed by the relentless engine in her mind. Most concerning to the staff were the changes in her demeanor. The docile, cooperative child was replaced by someone increasingly agitated and, at times, hostile. Dr. Reed documented a disturbing incident in early June when Clara became enraged after a nurse removed some of her papers for filing. Patient lunged at Nurse Sullivan with unexpected strength. Reed's report reads, scratching her face and arms while screaming, "They're not finished. The pattern is incomplete." It took 2 orderlies to restrain her, after which she collapsed and remained unconscious for nearly 14 hours. Upon waking, she had no memory of the outburst and immediately resumed her calculations during this period. Clara also began to speak of visitors who came to her room at night. Staff initially dismissed these as hallucinations, but a disturbing entry in the ward log from June 14th, recorded by a night nurse, suggests otherwise. Checked on patient CC at 2:15 a.m. after hearing voices from her room. Found her sitting upright in bed, seemingly conversing with the empty chair beside her. When she noticed me, she stopped mid-sentence and said in perfect clarity, "They're measuring how much is left. It's not enough anymore." I checked the entire ward. No unauthorized persons were present. Faced with this mounting evidence, Dr. Reed began to consider a possibility she was hesitant to include in official records but confided to Professor Morgan in a letter. "I am forced to consider," she wrote, "whether whatever knowledge has manifested in Clara might be, in a literal sense, consuming her physically. The correlation between her cognitive output and physical deterioration is too strong. It is as if her mind is a vessel for something too vast for her physical form to contain, and the vessel itself is cracking under the strain." This terrifying theory gained irrefutable support when Dr. Reed conducted a simple experiment. For 1 week in late July, Clara was gently but firmly prevented from any mathematical work. Her writing materials were removed, and the staff engaged her in the normal activities of a child her age. During this period, her physical symptoms improved with miraculous speed. Her weight stabilized, the headaches decreased, and no nosebleeds were recorded for a few precious days. She was a quiet, frail, but recognizably normal girl when the restriction was lifted. However, the results were catastrophic. Clara returned to her calculations with a renewed, desperate intensity within hours. All her symptoms returned with greater severity. Doctor. Reed wrote in her log that night, her words heavy with defeat. It appears that whatever drives her is stronger than her own instinct for self-preservation. When I asked why she continues despite the pain, she simply stated, "It has to be finished. They're waiting for it." By August, the hospital was in an impossible situation. Clara's physical deterioration had become critical. Yet any attempt to restrict her access to writing materials now resulted in such extreme psychological distress that Dr. Pierce, the hospital director, feared for her sanity. A grim compromise was reached. Clara would be allowed to write for limited periods each day under supervision. But as summer turned to fall, it became clear this was not a solution. Something would have to change if Clara was to survive. That change came on September 7th, 1916, from an unexpected source, opening another, even more disturbing chapter. On that day, a woman arrived at Missouri State Hospital number 4. She claimed to be Elizabeth Caldwell, the sister of Robert Caldwell, from Illinois. Hospital records indicate she presented meticulous documentation confirming her identity, including family photographs and correspondence with Robert that predated the family's move. Staff described her as a well-dressed, educated woman of about 40. Her manner composed, but her eyes filled with distress about her niece's condition. After reviewing Clara's medical files, she requested a private meeting with Dr. Pierce and Dr. Reed. The official content of this meeting was not recorded, but Dr. Reed's personal diary, discovered decades after her death, contains a troubling entry from that day. Met with E.C. regarding Clara. She wrote, "What she shared has left me deeply unsettled. It reframes this entire tragedy." According to Elizabeth, the Caldwell family had a history, a dark hidden legacy of what she termed episodes. These were instances where family members, almost always children, exhibited sudden, inexplicable abilities. Robert himself, she claimed, had experienced something similar as a child, though far less extreme. Most disturbing was her claim that 3 previous Caldwell children, from different generations, had died before adulthood after displaying symptoms remarkably similar to Clara's obsessive work, followed by rapid physical and mental decline. Elizabeth's confession was not of a crime, but of a curse. She claimed Clara's parents had fled to the Ozarks specifically to isolate her from doctors, fearing that if an episode occurred, she would be taken from them. The question remains. Doctor, Reed wrote, her script shaky, if her account is accurate, where are Robert and Mary now? And why would they abandon their daughter after going to such lengths to protect her? Within days, arrangements were made for Clara to be released into her aunt's custody. Dr. Pierce's final report indicates the decision was influenced by Clara's declining health and Elizabeth's assurance of specialized care. Critically, Elizabeth presented a notarized letter, apparently written by Robert before his disappearance, naming her as Clara's legal guardian. Professor Morgan, when he learned of the decision, objected vehemently, arguing that more research was needed. His concerns were overruled by the seemingly compassionate logic of returning a sick child to her family. On September 12th, 1916, Clara Caldwell left the hospital with the woman she was told was her aunt, traveling by private automobile into obscurity. What followed has been pieced together from fragmented sources, a few letters between Elizabeth and Dr. Reed, and a frustrated investigation by Professor Morgan in 1922. According to the letters, Elizabeth took Clara to a private residence outside Springfield under the care of a doctor, Thomas Blackwood, a supposed specialist in rare nervous disorders. Her condition allegedly stabilized, with the episodes becoming less frequent. In her last letter, dated March 1918, Elizabeth wrote, "Clara has good days now. We dare to hope." This was the last known correspondence. Dr. Reed's follow-up letters were returned. Address unknown. In 1920, her concern now a gnawing anxiety. She enlisted Professor Morgan's help. Morgan's investigation, documented in his personal papers, revealed a disturbing and meticulous fiction. The address in Springfield did not exist. There was no Dr. Thomas Blackwood registered with any medical association in Illinois or surrounding states. And most troublingly, through painstaking genealogical research, Morgan found no record of Robert Caldwell having a sister named Elizabeth, or any sister at all. Whoever had taken Clara from the hospital had created an elaborate fabrication. Clara Caldwell had vanished from the record as completely as her parents had from their cabin. The rescue was an abduction. As this realization settled in, Professor Morgan could not help but recall the strange, documented visit to the hospital months before the two quiet, serious men who identified themselves as representatives from the Department of War and had been granted a private, unrecorded interview with the child. The case, he began to suspect, was no longer about a family tragedy. It had become a matter of national security. The final documented chapter of Clara Caldwell's life story comes from an unexpected source, years after her trail had gone cold. In 1938, Dr. Harold Bennett, a diligent researcher from the University of Chicago, was studying mathematical prodigies when he came across obscure references to Clara's case in Professor Morgan's early papers. Intrigued, Bennett began his own investigation, a patient quest to track down any surviving records. His search eventually led him, in 1939, to an isolated sanitarium in northern Wisconsin. There, he discovered a woman in her mid-30s, registered under the anonymous name of Jane Doe. The woman, a resident since 1924, was almost entirely nonverbal and spent her days filling notebooks with abstract mathematical symbols. The staff, long having given up on understanding, simply provided her with paper. Viewing it as a harmless therapy, the attending physician, Dr. Ruth Crawford, told Bennett that Jane had been brought to the facility by a well-dressed woman who paid for 10 years of care in advance, in cash, and never returned. The woman had claimed Jane was her niece who had suffered a nervous breakdown, but provided no documentation. When Bennett showed Dr. Crawford the photographs of Clara Caldwell, the doctor confirmed the strong resemblance, though noting that years of illness had taken a severe toll. What truly convinced Bennett, however, were the notebooks. They contained calculations that, according to mathematicians who later reviewed them, represented a direct and seamless evolution of the work Clara had done as a child. It was a continuation of the same mysterious, internal language. Bennett visited the sanitarium several times, attempting to establish communication. According to his notes, published posthumously in 1964, he achieved only limited success. During his fourth visit, the woman looked directly at him, her eyes holding a brief spark of lucid intensity. She spoke her only recorded words in nearly 15 years, her voice a dry, unused whisper. "It's almost complete now," she said. "They're coming back for it soon." 3 days after this cryptic interaction, on January 17th, 1940, the woman known as Jane Doe was found dead in her room. The cause was listed as heart failure, though Dr. Crawford noted the unusual circumstances. The patient was discovered seated at her desk, pen in hand, having apparently completed a final complex page of calculations just moments before her death. Her expression was described by the attending nurse as peaceful, almost relieved. The vessel, finally empty, had been discarded. The mystery, however, was not yet fully redefined. That final, horrifying clarification would not come until 1962, when a construction crew, excavating for a new road near the former Caldwell property, uncovered human remains. Forensic examination determined they were the skeletons of a man and a woman who had died sometime in the 1915 to 1916 time frame. Circumstantial evidence strongly suggested they were Robert and Mary Caldwell. What was most disturbing, however, was not the bodies themselves, but how they had been found. According to the coroner's report, the remains had been deliberately arranged in a precise geometric pattern. One investigator with mathematical training recognized that the arrangement of the bones on the ground represented an equation, the same unusual notation found in Clara's earliest notebooks. This was the final, ghastly piece of evidence. Their disappearance was not an accident or abandonment. It was a component of the calculation itself. The Caldwell case was officially closed in 1963 by Shannon County. The official conclusion states simply, Robert and Mary Caldwell, deceased by means unknown. Clara Caldwell, whereabouts unknown, presumed deceased. But the discovery of the bones had redefined the event, transforming it from a missing persons case into something far more sinister, a ritual, a sacrifice, or a terrible consequence of an equation that required not just ink, but human lives as its variables. The legacy of the Caldwell case is not one of answers, but of a haunting obsession that rippled outwards, destroying the lives of those who got too close to its unknowable truth. Dr. Eleanor Reed, the psychiatrist who had tried to understand Clara, never truly escaped her patient's shadow. She continued to practice until 1924, when she abruptly resigned, according to former colleagues. Reed had become obsessed with Clara's case, devoting her free time to studying the few copies of the girl's work. A colleague later recalled that Reed had begun experiencing severe headaches and nosebleeds in the months before her departure, symptoms disturbingly similar to Clara's. Eleanor would lock herself in her office for hours, she recalled. She became convinced there was a message in the girl's calculations. She said once that she could hear the numbers whispering when she studied them too long. Doctor. Reed relocated to an isolated cottage where she lived in seclusion until her death in 1962. Among her personal effects was a journal from her final years, where she documented dreams of vast geometric landscapes. In one of her last entries, she wrote, "I understand now what Clara meant. The knowing doesn't want to be confined. It wants vessels, conduits, ways to flow between worlds. We were never meant to contain it." Professor James Morgan, the brilliant mathematician, met a similar, albeit less supernatural, fate. He remained at the University of Missouri until his retirement in 1942, but his interest in the Caldwell case cost him his professional reputation. Colleagues reported that his once promising career stalled as he devoted more time to what many considered an obscure curiosity. Former students described his apartment as a shrine to the mystery, its walls covered with reproductions of Clara's equations. His final academic paper, published in 1938, entitled theoretical frameworks for nonlinear knowledge acquisition, was largely dismissed by the academic community as the mathematical equivalent of ghost stories. Perhaps the most chilling secret, however, emerged decades later, shifting the entire case from a terrestrial anomaly to a potential cosmic event. In 1978, Dr. Rachel Norton, an astronomer at the Lowell Observatory, was studying unusual radio signals from a specific, unchanging region of deep space. She noticed a complex, repeating pattern within the signals that seemed strangely familiar. Consulting an old journal containing a reproduction of Clara's notations, she was stunned. The structural similarity between Clara's equations and the pattern of the radio signals was, she wrote, statistically impossible to be coincidental. In an unpublished paper, Norton suggested a disturbing possibility. What if Clara wasn't creating these mathematical systems, but transcribing them? What if her mind had become a perfect receiver for information being transmitted from somewhere else? And what if, most disturbing of all, whatever was transmitting had recognized her as a suitable vessel? So, what are we to make of the case of Clara Caldwell? Was she, as some have suggested, simply an unrecognized mathematical genius whose abilities manifested in a tragic way? Was her case an extreme example of savant syndrome, triggered by some undiagnosed condition? These rational explanations crumble under the weight of the evidence. They fail to account for the sudden, overnight onset of her abilities, the inexplicable disappearance of her parents, the geometric arrangement of their remains, and the systematic, multi-decade effort by government entities to classify and confiscate all related research. We are left facing a far more unsettling possibility that human minds can, under certain rare circumstances, become receivers for information that exists independent of human experience? And if so, what is the source of this knowledge? And what does it want from those who become its vessels? The persistence of the cover-up into the modern era suggests that Clara was not the only one. Reports of a paper on the Quell equations by an MIT physicist in 2014 being abruptly withdrawn, of original case files appearing at auction in 2015 only to be seized by a court order citing national security, and of a sealed box being unearthed at the University of Missouri in 2019 and immediately taken by the Department of Energy. All of this points to an enduring and active secret. The Ozark Mountains keep their secrets well. The exact location of the Caldwell cabin has been lost to time, deliberately obscured on official maps. But in the silence of those woods, something still echoes. The memory of a young girl, consumed by a fire not of this world. A warning that we are perhaps not alone in our thoughts, and that some knowledge, once received, comes at a price too terrible to imagine. The knowing, it seems, is still out there, whispering between the stars, calculating truth beyond our understanding, and waiting, patiently, for someone else who might provide room